Obviously, if there is no God and if he doesn't exist, then there's no point in praying to him or going to church or any of these things that Christians have been making a big deal of for a long time.
Despite the prevalence of religious belief, there's an awful lot of the world's population that does not believe in any deity. The population of China, for example, a large proportion of the population of Western Europe. In the United States, millennials and Gen Zs have some vague notion of spiritual but not religious.
We must understand these people who have turned to this are not to blame. They must bear their own kind of blame of individual choices, but basically they're not to blame.
When you look at myth, what you discover is that myth is often written in figurative language, often fantastic language, and therefore wasn't taken literalistically, even by those who accepted the myth as authoritative for their culture.
The church is to blame because the church, with its liberal theology, has left a vacuum.
But what fills that God-shaped hole is it's pretty variable. I mean, it was certainly, there's nothing in human nature that says that it had to be filled with the notion that if you accept that a guy who was nailed to a cross 2,000 years ago died for your sins, and the foremost of which was when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. I mean, that's not an intuitive idea.
Okay, so if this approach is correct, how should this shape the way, in your view, we read Genesis 1 through 11 then, and the story of Adam and Eve?
I think it should prompt us not to be over literalistic in the way we read these narratives. And once you begin to look at them in terms of mythohistory, it's difficult to look at them in any other way.
But to read Genesis as if it's failed science makes about as much sense as to read Genesis as if it's, for or against iPhones. I mean, imagine somebody reading Genesis and they're like, well, should I buy an iPhone or not? I'm not going to read Genesis to determine this. Well, clearly, the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing that.
In the Renaissance, men had attempted to mix Aristotle and Plato with Christianity. This new theology was an attempt to combine the rationalism of the Enlightenment with Christianity. It is often called religious liberalism. It was embarrassed by the supernatural and often denied it entirely. For example, the resurrection of Christ from the dead.
I mean, when you read a story about two people in an arboretum with these magical trees whose fruit, if you eat it, will grant you immortality or knowledge of good and evil. And then there's this talking snake who comes along and tempts them into sin. And then you have this anthropomorphic God walking in the cool of the garden, calling out audibly to Adam in his hideout. You think, well, of course this is figurative. And metaphorical language. This isn't meant to be read in this sort of literalistic fashion.
But it tried to hold on to a historical Jesus by sifting out from the New Testament all those supernatural elements which the New Testament taught about Jesus.
What about the matter of Adam being made from dirt and Eve being formed from one of Adam's ribs? Are those elements part of the myth in the mytho-history, or do you think they're historical?
I think that is part of the figurative language of myth. I have long been suspicious of things such as the creation of Eve from a rib out of Adam's side, as though God performed some sort of literal surgery on the man and built a woman out of it, or that God shaped this figurine out of dirt and then breathed into its nose the breath of life and the statue came alive. It seemed to me that this was clearly figurative language, but I didn't really have a reason for thinking that.
I'm convinced that a lot of these fights have tyranny, anxiety, skepticism behind them.
until I became acquainted with this genre called mytho-history. And it was precisely the classification of this sort of literature as mytho-history that I think provides a rationale or a reason for taking these sorts of details to be figurative or metaphorical.
This attempt came to a climax with Albert Schweitzer's famous book, Quest of the Historical Jesus.
This just came out with Erdman's. It's called In Quest of the Historical Adam, a Biblical and Scientific Exploration.
And we don't have a good language as scientists, let's say, as psychologists, or even as citizens. We don't have a good language for that kind of truth.
And the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing for or against evolution. So I think that these readers who want to make it for or against evolution are just utterly misreading and taking the story out of its original context, and therefore necessarily providing a really bad reading of Genesis.
And this book's going to get a lot of attention. I guarantee that.
It failed. It failed to rid the New Testament account of the supernatural and still keep an historic Christ. The historic Jesus could not be separated from the supernatural events connected with him in the New Testament. History and the supernatural are too interwoven in the New Testament. If one kept any of the historical Jesus, one had to keep some of the supernatural. If one got rid of all the supernatural, one had no historical Jesus. We should remember Schweitzer's humanitarianism in Africa, his genius as an organist, and his expertise concerning Bach. But unhappily, we must remember his place in the theological stream as well.
After the failure of the older theological liberalism, Karl Barth stepped into the vacuum. He held the higher critical views concerning the Bible. That is, that the Bible has many mistakes. But he taught that a religious word could break through from it.
A story that can change your life has a power that is best described as religious. And so religious is a kind of experience in some sense, rather, in addition to a claim about what constitutes truth.
This was the theological form of existentialism after existentialism had been accepted in its secular form. Thus, one more thing was added to the area of non-reason, along with all the other things that had been put there. In another way, we must have admiration for the Swiss Karl Barth, because while he was teaching in Germany, he spoke out clearly against Nazism in his Barmen Declaration of 1934. The teaching of Barth led to those theologians who said that the Bible isn't true in the areas of science and history.
And then those stories in Genesis, Cain and Abel, I think, and the story of Adam and Eve, because those stories are so deep that it's almost unfathomable. They get at the most profound of patterns. And so to say that they're literally true is actually to massively underestimate how true they are. Because you could tell me what you did this morning, and that would be literally true, but like, who cares? Whereas if you read the story of Adam and Eve, it's so true that it applies to everyone always. And mere literal truth can't do that.
But they nevertheless looked for a religious experience from it. And for many adherents of this theology, the Bible does not give absolutes in regard to what is right or wrong either.
In the book of Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve, you have evil located as a snake, right? So it's a predator. It's the predator in the garden, and predatory snakes were hell on primates. So there's plenty of evolutionary reason for that. But then you can imagine, so there's an insistence in Judeo-Christian thinking that the snake in the garden is Satan, which is a very odd idea. I tried to think that through. I thought, okay, snake as predator, other person as predator, group as predator, soul, inside your soul as predator. It's increasing psychologization of the idea of predator because, when we were animals, like other animals, we were preyed upon by straightforward predators and then by other people and then by other individuals. But then we figured out that battle was within. And if it isn't occurring within, then is it necessary that it is transferred to something that's occurring without?
I really like your point about how believing in original sin or that the battle is within makes you less susceptible to a simplistic "we're good, they're evil" narrative. I like that a lot.
Before you even come to the Bible and begin to read it, one must realize there are two ways to read the Bible. One is just one more religious thing among thousands of other religious things, which really are nothing more than another form of trip, not very, very different actually from a drug trip. The other way is to understand that the Bible is truth. And as such, what we're listening to is something that is completely contrary to what we hear about us on every side, namely merely statistical averages, relativistic things. Now, having said this, then I'd have to guard myself for the simple reason that it doesn't mean a person has to believe all this before he can begin to read the Bible and find truth in the Bible. I would just say in passing, I was not raised in a Christian family, and I was reading much philosophy when I was a young man, and I didn't read the Bible because I believed it was true. I read it just simply out of an intellectual honesty. But I did do one thing. I read it exactly the way it was written. Beginning with Genesis 1:1 and going right on, I read it the same way I would read another book, expecting that what was being given was a straightforward statement of what was meant, and that it wasn't to be read in a different level than I would read in the area of another kind of book. And as I read it, it answered the questions which already by that time I realized that humanistic philosophy couldn't answer. And over a 6-month period, I came to conclude that it was truth. But nevertheless, we must keep in the back of our mind, how are we reading the Bible? Just as another religious trip? Or am I really wrestling with the question of what is given in all the areas of which it speaks? Is this truth and compared to merely relativism?